Welcome to this webinar on the EU development cooperation policies, what business opportunities for SMEs. My name is Diego Albesano. I work for the Torino Chamber of Commerce. We are member of SESAM project. The event today is organized in the framework of this project. The scope, the goal of SESAM is to help companies participate in cross-border and transnational tender. And today we will have a 45-minute session organized by other partner like Centro Estero and Turin Chamber of Commerce. And I don't want to waste time. I just introduce our speaker today. That is Giada Rapalino. She worked for at RF company for the private sector on technical assistance project financed by European Commission and other donors, and supporting SMEs to apply for international bids for tenders. So please, Giada, let us know some useful information in order to have to use the opportunities that are for SMEs in this sector. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Diego, and welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you will find it interesting, and most important, you will learn a few things that maybe you don't know yet. So the objective will be to discuss what are the development cooperation policies that are in place as of today, who are the EU actors in development cooperation, what are the available funds, and I guess this is one of the main, most important, most relevant topics that we're going to discuss, because in turn this will translate into programming and implementing development cooperation. What are, in operational terms, the programs and the projects which will result into call for tenders and call for proposals. And then we will also have a look at what is aid management modes and delivery methods. And finally, a few slides about the actual business opportunities for SMEs. Last, we will have a short slot of about 10 minutes for your questions, so I kindly ask you to keep your questions for afterwards. So to start with, the legal basis which established the development cooperation policy of the EU is actually stated in the Treaty of the European Union, dating back to 2007 and then entering into force in 2009, and in the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, which is also known as the Treaty of Rome, which again was set in place back in 2007. So it generally states that the Union development cooperation policy shall be carried out with an integrated approach by the EU members and shall have also as its primary objective the reduction and eradication of poverty. Well, from the track record of the evaluation of the past experiences, we can definitely state that the development cooperation policies of the EU proved to have a positive impact on the supported countries and regions in the world. However, it is not so self-explanatory why development aid is also benefiting the EU as well. There are indeed reciprocal benefits, which can be summarized as follows. Aid stimulates the growth in developing countries and boosts trading opportunities by strengthening the demands in the local economy. Issues which may affect Europe could be also tackled in advance with some preventive intervention. And last, instead of acting as a separate member state, the EU acts as one, which is much more cost efficient. And I would also like to add that a side benefit are the actual contract opportunities arising from the projects and programs to be implemented in the local countries, which is in fact one of the reasons why you are attending this webinar. Let's have a look at the available resources that are set for the development cooperation policy of the EU. The European Union, along with its 28 member states, is the world's leading provider of official development assistance, ODA, with an overall amount of almost 78 billion euros. These data are taken from 2017. The EU and its member states have been consistently in the lead of global efforts on development financing. And this is just the most recent figure of a long-standing trend over the last 4 years. This amount is actually representing 0.5% of the EU gross national income, GNI, and it is significantly above the 0.21%, which is the average of the non-EU members of a committee which is called DAC, the Development Assistance Committee. So the EU collective ODA constituted the 75% of global ODA. And compared to the 24% of the USA, compared to Canada 3%, Japan 8%, and others, you can definitely say that there is a huge gap. While the European Union, only the European Union as international organization in itself is the 4th largest donor globally, we can say that the EU plus all its member states is the first donor in the world. So you can also understand by this that there is an actual interest of the EU to deal with development cooperation policy. In this map, you can see at a glance who are the countries that are allocating more funds towards the threshold of 0.5% of their gross national income. They are indeed located in the EU. You see the color that is more going toward brownish is indeed in the EU. So the EU takes an integrated approach to its external action. EU development policy aims to give disadvantaged people in developing countries control over their own development. That means addressing the causes of vulnerability, for instance, poor access to food, clean water, education, health, employment, social services, and so on. Eradicating disease and providing access to cheap medicine to fight epidemics. Reducing also developing countries' debt burden so that they have more money for their public investments instead of paying interest to rich lenders in the industrialized countries. It aims also at promoting self-help and poverty eradication strategies as well, and supporting the democratic process, improving respect for human rights, closing the gap on gender issues, and encouraging a more stable economic environment in which businesses can grow and create jobs. Let's have a look now at the financial framework for the implementation of the EU development cooperation policy. The multi-annual financial framework, MFF, lays down the maximum amount to be spent by the EU in different political fields over a 7-year period. The current MFF is covering the period 2014-2020, and the allocated budget is roughly 960 billion euros. So it provides a framework for the financial programming and the budgetary discipline by ensuring that the EU spending is predictable and stays within the agreed limits. It can be seen also as an expression of the political priorities and the budgetary planning too. Now let's see who are the main actors of EU development cooperation. Who are the actors involved in drafting the policies? We have the European External Action Service, EEAS, which is making the EU external action more coherent and efficient, increasing the EU influence in the world. It is actually a sort of EU diplomatic service, and it helps the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Mrs. Federica Mogherini, to carry out the Union Common Foreign and Security Policy. Then we have one of the other main actors involved is the EC Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development, usually known as DG DevCo. It designs the European international development and thematic policies and actually the river aids. Neven Mimica is the commissioner in charge of international cooperation and development, while Stefano Manservisi is the director general of DG DevCo and EuropeAid. So the EU development policy is coordinated at a central level in Brussels, but there are 140 EU delegations, which are their representatives in the world, implementing the development cooperation policies in the beneficiary countries where they are located. So overall, there is a total of 4,000 people working as staff of DG DevCo throughout the world. Next actor, we have the DG for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiation, commonly known as DG NEAR. It focuses on advancing EU neighborhood and enlargement policies and coordinates also the relation with the countries Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, which are the EEA and EFTA countries. Johannes Hahn is the commissioner in charge in this case. Next, we have DG Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection, ECHO, responsible for humanitarian aid and civil protection. The commissioner responsible in this case is Christos Stylianides. Last, we have the Foreign Policy Instrument, FBI, which is responsible for the operational expenditure of the EU foreign policy and the partnership instrument. It reports directly to the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Mrs. Mogherini, and works closely indeed with the European External Action Service, EEAS. The FBI Director and Head of Service is Mrs. Hilde Hardeman. Here we are now introducing what type of funds are available in terms of instruments and programs. Instruments are actually tools used to finance activities carried out by the EU actors, and the approach will depend on the context where they are used. So each instrument has a legal basis and it is created for a specific purpose. Let's look at the distinct geographical and thematic instruments which are now in place. First of all, we will address the thematic instruments, and we start with the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, EIDHR. The scope is to address human rights, democracy, rule of law, and enhance fundamental freedoms. It covers all the third world countries, and it has an allocated budget of about 1.3 billion euros. Next, we have the instrument contributing to stability and peace. Its strategic objective is to strengthen international security by improving crisis prevention and resolution capabilities. It has three specific objectives: to provide swift crisis response in political conflicts and natural disaster situations. It is also complementing humanitarian relief action and the intervention of the common foreign security policy. Second objective is to enhance the EU crisis preparedness, conflict prevention, and also peace-building capacity. And last objective is to build capacity to address global and trans-regional security threats. As these are quite big challenges to address in the current global geopolitical world, the allocated budget for this instrument is counting to 2.3 billion euros. Next, we have the International Nuclear Societies Council, which scope is to address nuclear safety, radiation protection, and nuclear material safeguard. It covers, again, all the third world countries, with the exception of, indeed, the most, let's say, the emerging economies. And the allocated budget is of 225 million euro. We have next instrument, the Partnership Instrument, which is having a strategic objective to project the EU policies to support the EU interest abroad and to address the major challenges. It has a global scope, but it focuses on the industrialized countries, emerging economies, and countries where the EU has a significant and strategical interest. This instrument is key to implement what is called differentiation principle, which is a prerogative of the EU to apply differentiated levels and methods of development cooperation depending on the region, the countries. So moving away from the usually known spread evenly across approach of the post-colonial era to focus on the selection of a restricted pool of countries to concentrate the development efforts to make them more effective. Now we will address what are the geographical instruments available. We have the European Development Fund, EDF, which is the main instrument for providing development aid to Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, Pacific countries, and overseas countries and territories. It covers cooperation activities in the field of economic, social, and human development, as well as regional cooperation and integration. It is funded by the member states of the EU, and it is not part of the EU budget, but it follows very similar rules. It is governed by an international agreement. The last one has been signed in Cotonou in March 2015, and it goes under the name of the 11th EDF legal framework. The total financial resources available for this instrument for the period 2014 and 2020 are amounting to 30.5 billion euros. For the Instruments for Pre-Accession Assistance, IPA, the main objective is to help the countries to meet the Copenhagen criteria. Copenhagen criteria are actually the rules that define whether a country is eligible to join the European Union. And it is also supporting these countries to reach to contribute to the objective of the EU 2020 strategy. The beneficiary countries are EU candidate countries, among which we have Turkey, Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, plus the potential candidate countries, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. For the European Neighbourhood Instrument, ENI, the geographical coverage is 16 Eastern and Southern European partner countries, and it is proposing bilateral activities, regional and cross-border cooperation to enhance the country's integration with the EU. Then we come to address one of the most relevant geographical instruments, the Development Cooperation Instrument, DCI. The objective is the eradication of poverty in the context of sustainable economic, social, and environmental development to support democracy process, good governance, and support of human rights. In particular, DCI includes also the newly established Pan-African Program, which is focusing on the strategic partnership between EU and Africa, supporting trans-regional, continental, or even global activities. The budget allocated for the Pan-African Program is a bit more than 4% of the whole DCI global budget. In the picture, we see the geographic coverage of the DCI instrument on the left, covering 87 countries in Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Latin America, ACP countries, with the exception of the NE and EDF countries. The budget allocated is 60% of the total, so it's amounting to almost 12 billion euros. While the picture on the right shows the thematic coverage of this instrument, where the budget allocated is 35% with 7 billion euros. So the main areas of intervention relates to, as we discussed, human rights, democracy, good governance, and so on. Here in the picture, you see at a glance what are the instruments to which are allocated the majority of funds. of the multi-annual financial framework. Another thing to be said is that almost all of the instruments of the multi-annual financial framework adopt a common implementation regulation. And this is to harmonize how the different instruments are implemented, establishing general rules on how the activities are approved and carried out. In general, it is envisaging a 5-step procedure starting from the identification to the formulation, financing, implementation, and evaluation procedure. Now I would like to quickly give an overview of the different steps in the project cycle related to the programming and implementation of development cooperation programs that the EU is adopting, to see how these programs will translate into actual projects at an operational level. So the project cycle management, commonly known as PCM, represents the whole management activities and decision-making procedures used during the life cycle of a project. It helps to ensure that projects are relevant to an agreed strategy and to address the real problems of the target groups and beneficiaries. It has to be feasible, meaning that the objective can be realistically achieved within the constraints of the operating environment, and of course, provided the capabilities of the implementing agencies. And it shall also generate sustainable benefits. Here, sustainability is the key, and we will see also why. Within the project cycle management, the logical framework approach, LFA, is an analytical and management tool which is used by the EC and by the majority of the multilateral and bilateral aid agencies, international organizations, NGOs, and so on. So first, we start with the programming stage, where a multi-annual indicative program, MIP, specify where EU development assistance will be distributed. It is drafted to cover a time span of 7 years period, and it is prepared jointly by the EU Parliament, the European External Agency and Services, and EuropeAid. When formulating these programs, the EU consults with the national and regional authorities in the recipient countries. So the multi-annual indicative program will be translated in country and regional strategies, which identify areas for funding in an annual action plan, APP. In this annual action program, there will be then the detail of the projects and the budget. The identification phase includes the country sector policy with a link with the overall political context and the stakeholder analysis. At this stage, the objective and results are to be defined, and there are preliminary identification on the implementation modalities and the partners to be considered. Here, at this stage, the complementarities with other donors and coordination, also on the lesson learned, is definitely crucial. At the end of this phase, an action document is to be issued. Next, we have the formulation phase, which is important because it is the phase in which action is designed. It comprises the intervention logic, the indicators to monitor progress in the implementation and to measure result, implementing modalities, and also which are the partners that are to be involved, the main activities to be carried out, and the monitoring and evaluation arrangements. In the implementing phase, when the European Commission has given its approval, the action of the Commission that have been decided in the annual action program can finally be implemented. In other words, it is at this stage that contracts and financial agreement with the recipient country that are receiving the funds allocated by the EC are signed. Implementing provisions are set in a common implementing rule. And next stage will be the monitoring stage. where all the budget and the projects of the annual action program are monitored during their implementation on a yearly basis. Which initiatives were allocated a too large budget, and which ones would require indeed more budget for further implementation. All these queries are to be addressed during this monitoring stage, and also data gathered in this phase is meant to be used as an advisory input to the multi-annual indicative program to adapt the budget for the next annual action program. And this is why it is called a project cycle here, because it is feeding also the programming stage. Last, we have the evaluation phase, and its purpose is to make an assessment of the ongoing or completed projects. Here in this case, the idea is to check how they were designed. The aim is to determine the relevance and the fulfillment of the objectives, the efficiency and their effectiveness, the impact that they have had, and also their sustainability. This is why sustainability is the key idea here, because we want these projects, these programs, and this policy to be sustainable in the future. An evaluation should provide information that is credible and useful, with the acknowledgement and incorporation of the lessons learned into the decision-making process of both of the recipient country, but also from the donors allocating the funds. This is why the evaluation is so important, because it is the European Commission itself that is learning from what has been done in the past and to try to incorporate the lessons learned into future actions. So why are these monitoring and reporting phases so important? Well, it aims at reducing also the risk for this sustainability to be taking place in the future. Now I would like to show you also how are the responsibilities shared during the whole project cycle, because we have many stakeholders involved. You see, we have partner countries, member states, the European External Action Service, the European Parliament, DG DevCo from the European Commission, and the actual EU delegations worldwide. So the delegations are at the forefront, and they are the driving forces during programming and implementation because of their closeness to the local context and their expertise in the field. However, we can claim that every one of these stakeholders is important in the definition of the inputs and during the different stages of the project cycle. Given that development aid is indeed a limited resources, which needs to be spent as effectively as possible in order to achieve the desired results, all the stakeholders are guided by the key principle of development effectiveness, which is country ownership, because indeed the beneficiary and recipient country needs to be empowered and needs to be feeling that they own the guidance of the development that we are proposing. Transparency and accountability is another key element. Focus on results. And finally, inclusive development partnership, which means that there needs to be a definite coordination, not only with the recipient country, but most important also with the other donors that are already carrying out their activities on field, and there has to be a participatory approach to include the community, to feel that these actions are going to be benefiting and are going to have an impact directly on the local communities. There are two kinds of implementation modalities for these programs to take place. There is a direct management and indirect management modes. In the first case, the Commission follows up everything from start to end. The money will be invested by the EC, and the project will be followed up very closely. The budget implemented is, let's say, is monitored by the departments at the headquarters or in the delegation or by the executing agency, but still it is centralized. Therefore, the European Commission or its executive agencies are the contracting authority, and they take decisions on behalf and for the account of the partner countries. With the indirect management, the Commission invests money but follow up the project from a distance. And this allocated budget is implemented by the recipient country, international organization, development agencies also of the member states or other bodies. I would like to add that there is also a shared management mode where the European Commission is delegating the implementation task to an EU member state. However, this mode is rarely used in the implementation of external actions, but there are few cases, for instance, in the joint operational programs on the cross-border cooperation, where this can take place. There are also different ways to implement the EU budget or the EDF funds, depending on the variable level of implication of the European Commission in its implementation. So there are three different aid delivery approaches: general budget support, sector policy support, and the implementation of projects. The budget support is the main method to assume ownership for the partner country, for the recipient country. It envisages a dialogue at the central level with the European Commission, financial transfer, and performance assessment and capacity development. How can a recipient country be eligible for a budget sector support? Well, the country needs to have a stable macroeconomic framework. There needs to be transparency and oversight of how the budget are used, and there must be in place already national policy reforms or sector policy reforms, and the financial management needs to be carried out from the state, from the public sector. The second method, the sector policy support, envisages programs which support the partner government program for a specific sector. So they are very focused on, let's say, health, education, transport, infrastructure support, and so on. It is implementing through some specific projects, so the sector policy support project, and common pooled funds or procurement and grants opportunities as well. Projects, last, they can support a government to implement a sector specifically and improve the service delivery, or can be designed and a standalone project. So they can be programs within the framework of a general program, an umbrella program, or it can be designed as standalone projects. It is composed of a series of activities aimed at bringing about clearly specified objectives with a defined time frame and a defined budget. Projects are subject to the use of donor procedures for the procurement of goods, services, works, and of course about the grants. In our case, we are talking about the EU procedures, which we will see also later on. I would like to mention also that there is another instrument that the EC is using a lot lately, which is blending, because it has gradually evolved into an important tool of the EU external cooperation since it was introduced first back in the multi-annual financial framework of 2007-2013, so the previous one. EU regional blending facilities have been now established in all regions of EU external cooperation. You see them in the map. Blending is the instrument for achieving EU external policy objectives, which is complementary to other aid modalities. So the principle of the mechanism is to combine EU grants with loans or equity from public and private financiers. It helps to mitigate the risk associated with investing in new markets, and so it can also enhance the impact of the EU development assistance and improve aid effectiveness, enlarging the budget and the funds allocated available. Now that we have identified the framework of operation and the legal grounds for the EU cooperation policy, let's look at where the most relevant business opportunities lie for the private sector. So as we have seen, the EU funding delivers aid to countries in need from two different sources: the European Development Fund, EDF, and the general EU budget. And it does so following the Practical Guide to Contract Procedure for EU External Action, generally known as PRAG, where the basic rules and procurement procedure for contracts are set. We can have procurement or grant procedures, which we will address separately as the next topic. And these procedures can vary according to the different arrangements for managing the project, as well as depending on the category of the contract. And within each category, procedures may also vary according to the value of the contract and the source of the money, and the year as well. So you now understand why it is absolutely necessary to have a very detailed guideline for all these different procedures, which are all indicated in the PRAG. As you can see, there are basic rules and then specific rules for the categories: service contracts, supply contracts, work contracts, and grants. You can also notice that the PRAG is a live document, which is periodically reviewed. The last release is in fact dated back to August 2018. Let's see more in details the procurement contracts. These are related to the requests issued by the EC to deliver specific services, goods, or work in exchange for payment. So calls for tender are published by Europaid, when they are seeking potential contractors, so that the procurement procedure will lead to the conclusion of a contract. The procurement procedure which follow the call for tenders are governed by specific rules which vary depending on the nature of the contract, on their category, their procurement type, as we have seen before. We have services, mainly technical assistance projects and studies. We have supplies related to provision of equipment and materials. And last, we have works related to infrastructure works and other engineering works. Then we can also say that it varies based on the threshold of the contract, because there are as little as 60,000 to 500,000 contracts which get to be publicly published, so that these bids are, let's say, more affordable for SMEs as well. Plus, the procurement procedures are ensuring the possibility to bid under a partnership approach, building consortia of relevant, eligible, and competent candidates, matching the different selection criteria. The basic mean of awarding all contracts is competitive tendering, but within competitive tendering, there are different procedures available to use, each allowing a different degree of competition: open, restricted, negotiated procedure, and so on. On the public website of Europaid, you can find published the documents related to the procurement notices and all the tender dossier, all the contract awards, as well all the information. to comply to the transparency and accountability directives that are in place for the EU. Here you see a few examples of supplies, services, and work contracts that have been published, call for tenders that have been published recently. And you see that we're spanning from supply of core switches in Ethiopia to technical assistance to the Ministry of Development Planning in Solomon Island, to do some works for the realization of infrastructure for water-related works in Togo. About grants we can say that it is a public invitation by a contracting authority addressed to clearly identified categories of applicants to propose operations within the framework of a specific EU program. So grants are direct financial contribution from the EU budget or from the European Development Fund. They are donations to third parties that are engaged in external aid activities. So the contracting authority is providing these grants, awarding these grants, which are used to implement projects or activities that relate to the EU external aid programs. Grants can fall into categories. We have grants for actions that are aimed to achieve an objective that forms part of an external aid program. In this sense, grants are used for financing projects that can be submitted within a certain program. For instance, calls for proposal for the support to resilience for sustainable livelihood in Kenya. And then there are also operating grants used to finance the operating expenditure of an EU body that is pursuing an aim of general European interest or an objective that is part of the EU policy. For example, we may have the call for proposal for operating grants, for structural support for European think tanks and for civil society organizations at European level. Grants cover the reimbursement of the eligible costs. In other words, these costs are effectively incurred by the beneficiary who is receiving the grant and are deemed necessary for carrying out these activities. So the results of the action instead remain the property of the beneficiary. Grants are subject to a written agreement signed by the two parties, and as a general rule, they require co-financing by the grant beneficiary. If you're interested to benefit from grants opportunities, you can register your organization in the eCause PADOR portal. The Potential Applicant Data Online Registration Database contains information on organizations applying for European Commission grants in the field of external assistance. Then to submit your application, the guidelines will specify whether you need to submit your application by post or online using the e-website, the e-call prospect. A prospect is the electronic system developed by Europaid to facilitate the submission of applications for call for proposal. All the necessary documents, for instance, the application form, all the guidelines you might need for your application are available and free to download at the Europaid publication website. So here you have also a list that this is a screenshot that I took from the Europaid website, where you can see the full list of what are the currently open grants that have been released recently. To give you some reference on the quantity of opportunities translating into contracts and grants related to the external actions of the EU development and cooperation activities, I can give you some figures related to the period January-October 2018. During this period, the EC published on Europaid 2,232 calls for tenders for services, 1,331 calls for tender for supplies, 391 calls for tenders for works, and 4,454 calls for proposal. So as you can understand, we are talking about big figures. And I hope that after this short module you have attended, you will have a better understanding on the width of the business opportunities from the private sector, which are stemming from the development and cooperation policy of the EU, which seems to be so distant, but in the end, it translates into concrete actions and concrete opportunities for the private sector, so that you can be pushed more into action and possibly already look into the currently open call for tenders and call for proposal, which will be relevant to your activities. I have now terminated my presentation, so I think that we have now about 10 minutes, more or less. We can open the floor to any questions from the attendees. You can use the chat bot that you find in order to send us your queries, your request for clarification, or anything you may need. And you can even write your comments if you have been happy with this presentation, for instance. Okay, I'm going to translate this because we have an international audience. So one of the attendees has been thanking for the presentation. Thanks a lot. And wondering if there is the possibility to have a copy of the slides for this. I think Diego can answer your queries.
Yeah, we can send a presentation, PowerPoint or PDF better by email to you. And I want just to add two more information that you can find also this presentation recorded on our Sesam YouTube channel. And on this channel you can also find the other presentation of the different webinars realized in the framework of the project. We are 5 participants to the project. There are participants from France, from Germany, and from Poland. So you can also check on the YouTube channel the other webinars. And you can have also more information about Sesam on our website, that is sesamproject.eu. So you can check all the activities realized on the website project. And I want just to add also another information, because as a Chamber of Commerce, together with 3 other local partners that are Regione Piemonte, Cuneo Chamber of Commerce, and Centro Estero, we are now working on a different project that is called Tender. The aim of Tender is to support local companies to participate in the participation of tenders bid by international organizations. So you can have more information on this project on the Centro Estero website, that is www.centroestero.org, where you can now also apply as a candidate to participate to the project. And let me also to invite you to participate to the kickoff of the tender that will be in Cuneo on the 8th of November. So you can find all the information again on the Centro Estero website. So thank you all for your participation to this event, and a special thanks to Giada for your really exhaustive and clear presentation. And I hope to see you in Cuneo on the 8th of November. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.